back to Weekend Today on your Sunday morning. Well, Australia's transportation could grind to a halt amid a major trucking crisis which is brewing this morning.
Yeah, it's all down to a worldwide shortage in a vital fuel ingredient called AdBlue, which means groceries may not make it to supermarkets before Christmas. Simon Ahare is CEO of Road Freight New South Wales, and he joins us now. Good morning to you, Simon. Thanks for your time. Okay, first up,
can you
just explain what AdBlue is and why it's important?
So AdBlue is an additive that we put into trucks to nullify the pollution that they put out from the diesel engines. AdBlue is made up of half of quality urea and the other half of deionised water. So those two things are mixed together and you get AdBlue. It's a really essential part of the trucking fleets in Australia. About half of all of Australia's trucking fleets use AdBlue to nullify that pollution so that we've got cleaner air.
We get ours from China mainly, who've shut down the distribution of it pretty much. How dire is the situation?
Look, the government says we've got about 5 weeks supply of AdBlue. What I'm seeing at the moment is a lot of purchasing by trucking operators, trying to get as much AdBlue as they can to ensure that they can keep the trucks running. Without trucks, as we know, Australia stops, and if you're looking at half of Australia's truck fleet not being able to operate, then we've got serious concerns. So we're looking to the government, and I understand the government's moving very quickly, the federal government's moving very quickly to ensure that we get extra supplies of this quality urea that I mentioned before so that we can make AdBlue for our trucks to keep them going. The key issue here is that we secure a new supply because about 80% of Australia's urea comes from China and other places. We get supplies from Japan and elsewhere, but the majority of it comes from China. And the key here is that not only do we get a long-term supplier, but we also get some short-term supply quickly as well. And I know the government's talking to the Middle East. It's reached a deal with Indonesia to get us some more. But these things within the supply chain are critical, and a lot of people wouldn't have heard of these sorts of things, but it's the little threads that are there in the supply chain that keep everything ticking over, which ensures that you've got food on the table, medicines in hospitals, and that we can drink our water. These things are really important.
Sure. Will this see a price rise on supermarket shelves, do you think?
Conceivably, what we're seeing is about a factor of 6 increases to AdBlue at the moment, which is quite significant, sometimes higher. The real question we've got here is how will the smaller operators be able to absorb these costs, because a lot of the time they don't have the power to be able to get price increases as a result of the increase to AdBlue. But by and large, what you will see is increases on the supermarket shelves and elsewhere. This is undoubtedly going to have an effect further on down the supply chain.
Why don't we produce this stuff here in Australia?
We do produce some of this stuff in Australia, only about maybe 10% if you're lucky, but I understand that that facility is closing down in the beginning of March 2022 in Brisbane. The question for us as a nation is, are we wanting to pay a bit more for supplies like AdBlue that are made here in Australia, or do we want to continue to rely on imports that are cheaper, but the supply may be iffy? That's the question for us, and that's a real question that government's going to have to wrestle with, but also the Australian people. Do we want it, or do we want to pay for something cheaper from overseas whose supply may be a bit iffy?
That's what we want to do.
So if we produced it locally, how much would that put prices up?
That's a really good question. Prices would go up, but it just depends on how we would do it. And the supply for AdBlue is always there because our truck fleets are expanding to use AdBlue much more. So it's certainly a growing market. So you'd have to think there'd be a pretty damn good business case in there.
What's your anecdotal evidence about how the truckies are doing? You know, I'm sure it's a tough game at the best of times, and are people going to lose their livelihoods here?
Well, if it goes beyond Christmas and we don't have supply, then there are real questions here. The last thing we want to see is our operators to park up and stop their trucks rolling. That's a real issue for us, and that's the last thing we want to see. And look, from our perspective, the freight industry stepped up through COVID, and I know Richard and Sophie, you and I have had discussions about this in the past about respect for truckies. This is another key issue for us to be able to ensure that trucking operators can keep moving, because if we don't have enough AdBlue, then you know, it's got real concerns for the rest of us.
100%. Simon, we appreciate your time. Thanks for shedding some light on the situation for us. Coming up, Aussies throw themselves into lockdown as testing